In March 2025, the German military historian Sönke Neitzel stated that this summer might be the last summer of peace for Germany and Western Europe. While some might call this a very pessimistic view, Neitzel was spot on in October 2022 after the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russia that many thought the Ukraine war might soon be over. Back then, he noted that we were not seeing the end of the Ukraine war, but maybe the end of the beginning. Here is referring to Churchill's statement about the Battle of El Alamein in 1942. And considering that the Ukraine war is still going on, it is without question that he definitely was not wrong. As such, in this video, we look at what are important elements of an industrial mobilization, or what I call world war management. Now you can also call it war management, but since we have to assume that Germany will be involved, we all know where it will end up eventually. At first, let us look at major elements we need to consider in a modern conflict in the 21st century. We have, of course, the traditional front line with the combat troops, support and logistical elements. Then we have the economic and industrial side. And between them, there we have the population that is either keeping the industry running or providing replacements for the front lines. Now, even in peace, there's a competition between these different elements, but in war, the competition gets really critical. So let us look at some specifically. For the industry, it requires a workforce that competes not only with the front line, but also with agriculture. Nowadays, this is less of an issue, but in the world wars, it's still quite a large labor force. Transportation is a very important element here. This includes both national and international levels. This requires proper allocation and scheduling that the industry can work. Additionally, the energy that is consumed is also used by the industry. For instance, in the Second World War, Germany tried to produce aluminium in France, but there was not enough coal. To make the aircraft, France would need aluminium, and though France had bauxite and smelting capacity, it lacked the coal necessary to generate electricity. The French calculated that to meet the German demands, they would need a delivery of 120,000 tons of coal per month. Germany could only promise 4,000 tons. Then there's, of course, money. And finally, resources, which need to be acquired either directly by mining, but also trade. In every way, they need to be transported. Of course, it gets a bit more complicated. So let us look at some major problems. First, in terms of international trade, a large amount of this is conducted via the seas. To quote a work from 2008, globally, maritime trade constitutes over 75% of all international trade. As such, the protection of sea lanes, as we can see currently in Yemen, is a major issue, particularly once military starts engaging there as well. In terms of skilled workers, we have several issues historically and now even more. First off, there was always an issue in acquiring, keeping or shuffling around a skilled workforce. If not enough is produced in one sector, for instance, Germany at one point after the defeat of France reduced ammunition production in the Second World War, this led to the people leaving this industry, which later on were dearly missed, but nowadays this is even more of an issue due to the aging population that is leaving or even left the workforce that can't be replaced. According to Mike Rowe, just for building US submarines, the industry is lacking 100,000 tradespeople. To quote, "Construction companies in particular are desperately short-handed, and the submarine industrial base, a collection of 15,000 separate companies charged with building 4 nuclear-powered submarines, is looking to recruit 100,000 tradespeople over the next 9 years. 100,000. Now, Mike Rowe is an activist in the blue-collar area, so these numbers might be inflated, but generally there's a lack of tradespeople that is not limited to the United States and specific industries. Speaking of submarines and skilled labor, in the Second World War in February 1942, it was noted that the German submarine production went down by 20%. Specifically noting that this was not due to a lack of resources, but a lack of skilled labor. Although unlike to the first 2 world wars, the agricultural industry nowadays are far less labor intensive. In times of war, it is a major issue. Not only since food is crucial, but there is a major competition for resources from the chemical industry. To put it simply, at one point the question might be, do you produce ammunition or fertilizer? And all of this, of course, has to be balanced with the morale of the population. Let us look at some major problems that industry were facing during major wars. First off, the old-time classic, the ammunition crisis. In the First World War, every major nation had one, to give just one example. The planned French production of artillery shells of all calibers in the time of war was little over 7,000 per day, chiefly of 75mm shells. This was thought to be sufficient. By 1917, production had exceeded 260,000 shells per day, of which more than 220,000 were for the field artillery. The production and consumption of shells had multiplied by a factor of 40 on average compared to the initial forecast. This is also an issue for smaller conflicts as well, particularly in regards to high-tech ammunition. For instance, in 2011, during the military intervention in Libya, there was a shortage of ammunition among the European forces that were involved. To quote a Washington Post article from April 2011, less than a month into the Libyan conflict, NATO is running short of precision bombs, highlighting the limitations of Britain, France and other European countries in sustaining even a relatively small military action over an extended period of time, according to senior NATO and US officials. Next is the competition between fighting and labor force. Here you can see a pickaxe, since in the First World War the British started to dissuade miners from joining the troops. Unexpectedly, shortages of goods proved more immediately pressing than the shortages of soldiers, and labor scarcities rather than the anticipated unemployment became national problems. Hence the British authorities now attempted to dissuade miners from volunteering, and in both France and Germany, industrialists, under pressure from the state to increase munitions production, brought irresistible counter-pressure on the governments to restrict recruitment and recall soldiers to the factory. In France, industrialists themselves were even empowered to recall men from frontline units, and by the end of 1915, against the protest of the generals, about 500,000 former soldiers had been brought back to the French munitions industry. The next one is not necessarily a recurring problem in a specific sense, it is more of an example that we are dealing with a global world, where major changes that might be beneficial for the member of one alliance might be detrimental to a member of the same alliance. An example is Japan before it entered the Second World War. The war in Europe in 1939 and 1940 created major problems since shipping space was no longer available. In the last 3 months of 1939, the total shipping tonnage of all nations in Far Eastern waters dropped from 4.5 million tons to 3.2 million tons, the remainder being almost entirely Japanese. In the spring of 1940, the German invasion of Denmark and Norway resulted in the removal by Britain of almost all the few remaining Scandinavian ships in the Far East. This put a major burden on the Japanese trade fleet, which was also needed to ship troops and supplies. Which leads directly to the next point, losses, both from combat, but also simply wear and tear due to transportation, machine tools and other equipment being used more. In times of war, often production is increased, so instead of a manufacturing belt running for 8 hours a day, it runs for 16 hours. Or ships carrying more and or having less time in the harbor. Then there are of course combat losses and battle damage. Overall, this results in more replacement of parts or even complete equipment. Here again, an example from the German U-boat force in February 1942. It was noted that about 6,000 skilled workers, which was about 10% of the total workforce employed in the building of submarines, was needed for maintenance of the submarines. For the next part, we particularly look at the comparison between the US industrial mobilization in the First and Second World War, since there were some stark differences. We generally seem to think about the Second World War, where the United States equipped other nations with a lot of their own equipment, particularly the M4 Sherman, but also trucks and radios. Yet for the First World War, the story is quite different. To quote, "When the United States entered World War I on 6 April 1917, it was ill-prepared to meet the challenges and demands of mass industrial mobilization. Pre-war efforts to enhance coordination, equipment and doctrine were inadequate. The lack of relevant experience and modern designs, resource shortages, and deficiencies in organization, coupled with the immediate need to rapidly expand its production capability, left the United States heavily dependent on its allies to equip and train its forces. Output of most equipment and munitions did not begin to meet wartime requirements until just a few months before the armistice on November 11, 1918. Some equipment, such as tanks, never did." This of course begs the question why there were such strong differences. Although the United States did prepare the industry for entering the First World War, this preparation was not enough. for the Second World War, US leadership began early on, particularly with the US namely in 1934 with the Vincent-Trammell Act of expanding the fleet by 102 ships in the upcoming 8 years. As evidence of the importance of pre-war naval modernization, every naval capital ship, every fleet carrier and battleship that fought in World War II was authorized before Pearl Harbor. There was also central planning and control, particularly the allocation of resources and transportation was crucial, as well as price regulation. Another major factor was the recruitment of experts from the private sector, for instance Bill Knudsen. Initially there were also so-called GOCOs, which means government-owned, contractor-operated. Here the government paid for large factories and thus covered the risk if the demand might not be there, and leased the facility to contractors from the private sector. Once full mobilization started in 1942, GOCO was no longer sufficient. As such, civilian production was converted to military production. Another major aspect was of course standardization of products, like the Liberty ships. Finally, we also needed to look at problems that are new for the 21st century. These problems are derived from a paper about US challenges. For Europe, we probably can add there's probably far less preparation done, both in thought and substance. The production of equipment is too economically efficient for war. What do I mean with this? Simply put, there are not enough production lines and there are huge dependencies on single companies. For instance, the US Department of Defense in 2018 found that 80% of the US Marine Corps and US Army vehicle production is done by one manufacturer on one assembly line. Next, the complexity of modern weapon systems is extreme. For just testing the wiring in a modern Eurofighter, there are 1,200 blocks and a total of 40,000 test points. The total testing phase takes about 10 days. Such work processes might get optimized in war, but it would still require personnel that is highly or at least well trained. For more details, you can check this video for military aviation history on the production of the Eurofighter. This complexity directly leads into the next points. Changing production lines from civilian to military production in many cases is probably completely unfeasible. Additionally, even if this is possible, the civilian industry is generally far less prepared and secured against cyber attacks. Furthermore, if the previous issues are dealt with, the workers need a proper security clearance. Remember in the very beginning that there's generally a problem with the allocation of skilled workers? Well, now add this issue on top. Finally, there's also international issues as well. For instance, initially Turkey was in the F-35 program. That meant that about 1,000 unique parts out of the 300,000 were manufactured in Turkey. Well, Turkey did something that was not particularly liked by the United States. As such, they were dropped from the program. It took years to replace those parts. To summarize, the importance of proper organization and allocation of manpower, facilities, resources, and transportation are central problems in a war. Even if resources are largely available with a proper workforce and/or transportation systems, the exploitation is limited. Resources are also a complete new problem, since even simple raw resources like iron ore or oil often have difference in quality and composition that require special facilities that might not be available everywhere. To just name one example, but maybe that is something for the future. Big thank you to my supporters on Patreon and subscribers now. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script. Thank you for watching and see you next time.